Diane, you want to go ahead and welcome everyone?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. All right. So I just want to remind everybody, I've posted in the chat, if you'll post both your first and last name along with the community that you represent in the chat box. We're starting to give credit to communities for participating in our sessions. Also, if you have a question or a comment, if you'll post those in the chat box as well, we'll get to those as soon as possible.
All right, so everybody, we're gonna get started here in just a moment. I just want to give a special good morning to Julius. We have our team Jack this morning. We have our Julius. We have Amy. And we have Cheyenne. And so we've worked on this presentation for y'all this morning to talk about floodproofing, because I think it's something that a lot of communities don't know a lot about. And we went through this presentation. We realized that there was a lot of things that people, or a lot of the documentation doesn't have all the pieces and parts that it should. So if you've ever wondered about floodproofing and what the documentation should look like, how thorough it should be, today is your lucky day, because that's what we'll be doing and talking about. So I'll bring the presentation up and we'll get started. Is there anything you want to say, Julius?
No, just welcome everyone to another monthly session. Definitely a big kudos to Amy and Cheyenne for continual. I know as we transition past COVID, we gonna continue doing the monthly webinar, different topics, in addition to our 3-day virtual training and our L2 free courses. So definitely bringing various amount of trainings to our Tennessee communities, because we want you guys to be well informed, and also about the NFIP 101, that self-paced training that's available online as well too. So there's going to be different avenues for trainings for all 402 communities in Tennessee. So we definitely want you guys to participate, whether it's the monthly topics or the L2 in person, or the 3-day virtual, or the self-paced training. We just want you guys to be engaged in trainings, because we're going to be keeping track of trainings, your participation, because we want all 402 communities to be well-versed in understanding floodplain regulations. In order for Amy and I and Cheyenne to provide better support to you, you guys have to be speaking the same language that we are speaking when it comes to floodplain management. So Amy, it's your show here. Support Tennessee and support Amy and Cheyenne. And thank you guys for being on the webinar with us this morning.
Thank you, Julia. So I did think of you when I was driving this morning, because I saw another license plate that said BFF. So second time, y'all, in a week that I've seen the license plate that says BFF and then a number beside it after it. So I think about floodplain and it makes me giggle. So we're going to have fun today. One thing to keep in mind, we are going to start tracking communities and how often you attend the trainings. My leadership kind of wants to see what communities are participating versus those that are not, just to kind of get an overview of how much participation we're having. So it is important that when you have time available, that you attend these webinars. We are going to be doing our 2023 schedule. So if there's something that you're burning to know, something that you're interested in, that you want to have a session on, please put it in the chat so that Cheyenne can record it, and so we can start to get our list of topics for 2023. So we're going to continue to do this. It's something I really enjoyed. I think you guys have as well. And so we'll get started with it. So as being the state coordinator, one of the blessings that I have in my life is that a lot of you guys ask questions, or you have different development proposals available in your community. You say, hey, Amy, can you take a look at this? Can you tell me if this is correct, if that is correct? And so one of the things that Julius and I do every Monday, and Cheyenne, we have a 3-hour meeting where we go through different issues and concerns statewide regarding floodplain management. So one of the things that we talked about in the past is floodproofing. So when we were doing this presentation and getting it together, it was kind of interesting to see all the different pieces and parts for floodproofing, and how some of the documentation is missing a lot of this information. So you may think you know a little bit about floodproofing, but I can guarantee you after today, you will know a lot more. And you'll realize that when you get a submittal in the future, that there's many other pieces and parts that need to be addressed. So with that, we're going to get started. So FEMA has technical bulletins on a variety of topics. They have 11 different bulletins on various floodplain management issues. And one of the ones we're going to be talking about today is requirements for the design and certification of dry floodproofing non-residential and mixed-use buildings. So essentially, it's for any kind of new and substantially improved non-residential building and mixed-use buildings that are in a floodplain, that are in a special flood hazard area on a flood insurance rate map. So essentially, you're going to see it for Zone A, whether it's Zone A, AE, AH, AO is on your flood insurance rate map. Residential buildings in Zone A and Zone AE do not permit the use of dry floodproofing. So as you can see here on this map, on the left-hand side, you have Zone A where you don't have any kind of base flood elevation information known. And on the right, you have Zone AE where you have more detailed base flood elevation. So again, if you have a community, if it's in a shaded area, if it's in a Zone A, Zone AE, and it's residential, it's not permitted to do any kind of dry floodproofing with the NFIP. FEMA has another additional technical bulletin. So if you're an engineer and you're on the call today, one thing that should be referenced is FEMA P, that's for publication 936. It gives information on the designs and certification of dry floodproofing measures that involve engineering evaluations and calculations. So for those cool people on webinar today, if you guys have questions, this is a good reference to use whenever you're doing a floodproofing certificate, to look at all the pieces and parts that go into making a structure dry floodproofed, wet floodproofed, and when you're looking at various categories for site selection, for how you're going to deal with buoyancy, hydrostatic, hydrodynamic forces, and different things, and how to do the calculations correctly. This is your guidance to use. Now, if you're a floodplain administrator and you're working with someone that's an engineer and they have questions, please refer them to this document for additional guidance. So exactly what is floodproofing, right? It's any combination of structural and non-structural additions, changes, adjustments to the structure, which is going to reduce or eliminate flood damage. And again, you also want to look at the property. You want to look at water and sanitary facilities, structures, and their contents. Dry floodproofing is a combination of measures that make a building and attendant utilities and equipment watertight and substantially impermeable to flood water, with structural components having the capacity to resist flood loads. So a lot of times people just think about, well, I don't want water to get into my structure, but you also have to think about utilities that are servicing the building and how you're going to deal to make sure that water isn't going to saturate or come into those elements. Wet floodproofing is not defined by the NFIP regulations. The term is used in FEMA guidance publications and by floodplain management professionals to mean the use of flood damage resistant materials and construction techniques that intentionally allow flood water to enter and flow through a structure without causing damage. So a lot of times, especially when I first started in this job, when Stan was teaching me, he would say, okay, Amy, if a structure was functionally dependent upon water, so like if you're up in Cheatham County and there's a barge facility that could allow wet floodproofing because water could come into the building when they're building those barges and not necessarily harm or do anything to it. And sometimes wet floodproofing is used to refer to requirements for enclosures below the elevated building in a Zone A when the enclosures are used for the spa treatment for storage, parking, and access. I did it right, Julius. For residential building and residential ancillary areas. So residential building, if you want to know what that means, it means it's used for habitation. So if someone is living there, if someone is staying there, if someone is using it as a home or a vacation, that is considered residential. Someone is habitating that area. Ancillary areas for residential areas include laundry facilities, storage rooms, mail rooms, recreational rooms, parking garages, and exercise facilities. So again, these are uses that we as human beings would use in a building for either rest or recreation or just daily life. So the definition for substantially impermeable is the use of materials and techniques that restrict the passage of water and seepage through passageways. So if you think about a building, you think about the joints, the cracks, the openings, the channels, and the points of entry, and that limit accumulation of water during flooding. The American Society of Civil Engineers, 24, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers define it as a structure is considered substantially impermeable if the maximum accumulation of water is not more than 4 inches in a 24-hour period without relying on devices for the removal of the water. So for non-residential buildings, a building owner has to propose dry floodproofing measures for a non-residential building that is in an NFIP participating community. So the owner, through the use of either an engineer or an architect, is going to provide certification that includes structural design, specifications, plans for the construction, exactly what type of dry floodproofing measures are developed and reviewed by those professionals. So sometimes when I've been sitting here, someone will send me a floodproofing certificate and there's no kind of structural design, there's no kind of specifications. I actually, a couple times I've had the floodproofing certificate just signed with no information. So again, when someone is going to be dry floodproofing a building, there has to be design specifications and plans, right? So again, for Tennessee, the use of professional engineers or architects are the design professionals that have to sign and seal those certifications that you're going to have the required performance and you're going to have the acceptable standards used to floodproof the building. This is a form that I referred to a moment ago. It's form 86-0-34. It's a floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures. And this really provides information for insurance underwriters to rate dry floodproof buildings. And again, it's the same sort of certificate that should be used for compliance standards for NFIP. And again, design professional is going to certify as-built drawings and inspection. And the certification also identifies the American Society of Civil Engineers 24-14 and 24-05 as the accepted standard of practice. So one of the first things that we talk about a lot in floodplain management is site selection, right? Exactly who, what, where, when, why, what is happening in an area. So you can see here on this flood insurance rate map for the town of Smyrna that it actually has your identified special flood hazard area. So whenever someone is coming into your office and they have questions about developing in a site, the first thing you're going to want to do is pull up your flood insurance rate map and determine the parcel and the structure and if it's in the special flood hazard area. So certification of elevation to which a building is being floodproofed. That is where you're going to want to have it signed and sealed by a licensed land surveyor. This authorized to certify elevation information. So again, you have to look at the elevation where the BFE is determined by the flood insurance study, or if it's in a zone A, the height above the lowest adjacent grade. So again, there has to be elevation information as part of this application package so that you know what the base flood elevation is or the highest adjacent grade in relation to the finished floor elevation. So with this certification by an engineer or architect, again, they have to have design specifications, as-built drawings for construction and physical inspection, and they have to be designed in accordance with standard engineering practices that meets the ASC 24-05 and 24-14, and then making sure that the building is watertight, substantially impermeable, and have structural components that are capable of resisting flood forces. So that kind of goes hand in hand with having elevation information to make sure that the structural components are either at or above the base flood elevation. If it's below that, there needs to be documentation how it's going to resist flood forces. Non-residential buildings in Zone A and Zone AE, dry flood proofing is permitted for new and substantially improved non-residential portions of mixed-use buildings in Zone A and Zone AE, but not for residential buildings in Zone A or Zone AE. So again, this is just for non-residential buildings. So if you have someone that's coming in that says, hey, I have this old residential building and I want to flood proof it, your answer should always be no based upon your NFIP regulations and attending this webinar today. So the definition of residential refers to dwelling units and the ancillary areas. And again, building systems are going to include your electrical, heating, ventilation, plumbing, and air conditioning equipment and other service equipment. So if you have service facilities that are in a building, you want to make sure that those are flood proofed as well, so that you don't have the accumulation of water. So all these things have to be written out when you're looking at the flood proofing certificate and when you're looking at an engineer submittal to make sure that all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed for this. Because, you know, when we talk about floodplain management, we talk about HVAC units, they should be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation so you don't have the accumulation of water coming in there. And so Julius and I, we've done a couple cabs together. The one thing that we always see is that the air conditioning unit is slab on grade, right on the ground. So if there was a flood event, it's going to get zapped. So non-residential can be buildings with commercial or non-residential uses. And the American Society of Civil Engineers 24 has a more extensive definition that residential defines non-residential buildings as those that are not classified as residential. And it does provide additional commentary on mixed use and residential portions of mixed use buildings. So if you're a building inspector or if you're an engineer, you should be looking at this to make sure that you understand these additional definitions, because a lot of times in Tennessee, people say, well, building codes don't really go with NFIP. Some of this other stuff doesn't really go with NFIP, but in all actuality, everything is in unison, everything. There's synchronicity between the different types of professional standards. It's just having a better knowledge and understanding of those. So for mixed use buildings, FEMA considers a mixed use building, and we had a question recently in East Tennessee where it was talking about mixed use buildings and why can't it be flood proofed? And this is a really good slide to have knowledge of when someone has a question about mixed use, because the non-residential portions of the mixed use buildings are allowed to be dry flood proof, provided that all residential units, building systems, and service equipment that serve the residential units and ancillary areas used by those residents are elevated above the required elevation. So essentially, this building is a good example of, let's say the first floor is just, let's say there are restaurants or commercial uses, and then you have the residential areas above that. You don't want to have the residential areas on the ground level, because again, that would be considered a residential building. But if you have mixed use and you have the non-residential on the first floor that's at or above the base flood elevation. Can you guys please silence or mute yourselves? Thank you. So for dry floodproofing measures, you want to make sure the portions of the building, including the walls and slabs, are reinforced to resist water pressure. And another thing that we don't talk enough about is about floating debris impacts. When Julius and I were doing a cab recently, we saw some manufactured homes that were just dry stacked. They weren't anchored. They didn't have the tie over frames. And then a lot of times when we see different type of accessory structures, if someone has, let's say, a shed or a she shed or a he shed, and they don't have it anchored, a lot of times communities don't think about floating debris impacts. So again, you want to make sure that doors and windows are designed to be watertight when closed without flood shields, and then have removable or permanently installed substantially impermeable panels to cover doors, windows, and other openings. Or if you have paint, membranes, gaskets, other sealants to reduce water seepage. Or if you have sump pumps or other self-priming pumps that control the level of seepage water. And again, if you're going to have sump pumps on there, you're going to want to have design standards to show how much water can accumulate in a 24-hour period, and are those sump pumps or self-priming pumps going to work to remove that water from the structure. Also, backflow, non-return valves or shutoff valves to prevent flood water from entering through the sewer and drainage pipes, or sewage ejectors that pump in sewage to above the flood protection level before the pipes connect to a vertical sewer line. And then making sure that seals prevent the entrance of floodwaters through joints and utility penetrations. Electrical equipment and circuits should be protected to the flood protection level, and making sure that if you have backup or emergency power for sump pumps and other control measures, that is protected to the flood protection level. So again, no matter what you're trying to do, the thing that you have to know is where the base flood elevation is and what the elevation is of these service utilities, and then making sure they're at or above the base flood elevation. If they're not, then there has to be documentation of how you're going to address the accumulation of floodwaters, or how you're going to stop them from entering these different components to causing additional problems or additional damage to the structure. Planning considerations. It was funny, the other day I was at an event. I was actually at Monell's with some friends, and a lady said, "What do you do?" I said, "Oh, I do planning." And she said, "Oh, party planning?" And I said, "No." And then I told her a little bit about what I do. When we think about planning considerations, a lot of people don't think about, when they're developing a site, all the pieces and parts that should be considered when you're doing floodproofing, right? So again, you want to look at the building location. Am I down in the bottom of a cereal bowl where floodwaters are going to accumulate on my property and in my structure easily? What are the flood characteristics? What are the flood velocities? What are the depths? What's the duration of flooding? How quickly is floodwaters going to rise and debris impacts? So Julius and Cheyenne and I were looking over the presentation yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of times people think that they have more time, that if a flood event starts, that I have more time to kind of get my stuff and get out of Dodge really quick, right? But that's not always the case. Just like when we had our Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers Conference, and Larry showed that video about 3 minutes where the floodwaters were rising in Waverly, and how residents there didn't really have any time to evacuate or try to protect themselves from floodwater or their belongings. So again, looking at how fast the floodwaters are going to rise, the level of protection required, the flood warning time, safety and access. If someone's in a building and is supposed to be flood proofed and there's a rain event, how are they going to be able to safely get out of the structure? Or if they need to get into the structure, what's a flood emergency operations plan? Who's in charge of that? The worst thing in the world is if, let's say, you have a floodgate and you're trying to install it, let's say at the entry of your building, and you've never ever touched it. The worst time in the world is if there's a flood event, because you're going to be cussing and fussing because you've never ever used it before. So again, you want to have emergency operations plans where you have someone that's kind of the grand poobah, the person in charge. And you also want to have an exercise maybe once a year or twice a year to make sure that you and your staff or employees at a building know how to install it, because it's no good if nobody's ever touched it and it's just laying up against a wall and there's a flood event and it doesn't do anything to protect the building. And then you also want to have inspection and maintenance plans as well. So again, the defining characteristic for Zone AE is to make sure that the lowest floor, including basement of a residential buildings, to be elevated to or above the BFE. And non-residential buildings in Zone AE must be elevated or dry flood proofed to or above the BFE. So again, these are similar standards that are in the flood damage prevention regulations. You know, just understanding that residential should be elevated 1 foot above the BFE if you have the statewide model, and if you have a non-residential building and it can't be elevated, or if it's already been there for a long time, it can be dry flood proofs to or above the BFE. So there are some requirements. This is the Code of Federal Regulations. This is 60.3C3. And so I'm not going to read all this, but essentially you have to have the lowest floor, including basement, of a non-residential structure elevated above the base flood level or together with the attendant utility and sanitary facilities be designed so that the base flood level, so that below the base flood level, the structure is watertight with walls substantially impermeable to the passage of water and with structural components having the capability of resisting hydrostatic and hydrodynamic loads and the effects of buoyancy. This is for zone AO. Not a lot of communities have this, but we wanted to put this in here just to talk about for non-residential structures or substantially improvements of those non-residential structures, having the lowest floor elevated above the highest adjacent grade, at least as high as the depth number specified in feet on the community's flood insurance rate map. If there isn't anything listed, you want to have it at least 2 feet above. And then making sure that the attendant utility and sanitary facilities are flood-proofed as well. This is also talking about 60.3 C4, making sure that the flood-proofing designs are certified. So again, you have to have a registered professional engineer or architect. They're going to have to develop a structural design, specifications, plans, and then they're going to have to certify those and making sure that they're in accordance with standard engineering practices, or as we talked about, the ASCE 24-05 and 24-14. So some of you guys are building inspectors that are attending this webinar today. So the International Residential Code does not allow for dry floodproofing. So if you're a floodplain administrator, and let's say you're not a building official, and let's say you can't remember it, if you have a building inspector on staff, they should know that dry floodproofing can't be within residential structures if they have their certification of this. So again, as we talked about earlier, a lot of different standards coincide, complement, enhance floodplain management, and this is one of those instances. Definitions of dry floodproofing. So when you look at the International Building Code 2018, again, talking about a combination of design modifications resulting in a building, including the attendant utilities, equipment, and sanitary facilities being watertight with the walls that are substantially impermeable to resist loads. And then you can just see that from the 2015 to 2018, there was no change. And then from the 2012 to 2015, they did add equipment. So this is just additional definitions for dry floodproofing. Again, making sure a structure and its utilities and equipment are watertight with all the elements substantially impermeable and with structural components having the capacity to resist loads. And then one change they did was to expand the definition to require the building and utilities and equipment servicing the building to be watertight with walls substantially impermeable to resist flood loads, rather than just only requiring the building envelope to be substantially impermeable. So again, one thing to remember, tie that little bow on your finger, is to make sure that dry floodproofing for the International Building Code and the American Society of Civil Engineers 24 is equivalent to the definition, the NFIP definition of floodproofing. So again, it all kind of complements one another and it all kind of goes in unison. So there are some general flood hazard area requirements. So again, when you're looking at the 2018 International Building Code section 1612.2, when you're looking at design and construction, requires that building and structures located in flood hazard areas be designed and constructed in accordance with Chapter 5 of the ASCE 7 and 24, and then just talks about how it recently was renumbered. So again, it exceeds 60.3 A3 with more specificity. And then also looking at flood hazard documentation, it does require submission of a certification statement prepared by either a professional engineer or architect that the floodproofing design is in accordance with ASCE 24. So that's something that I haven't ever seen before in some of the documentation. So moving forward, this is going to be a good reference if some of you receive a floodproofing certificate from an engineer, cross-referencing Technical Bulletin 3, looking at the FEMA publication 936, or all the documentation included in the package, and has it addressed all these different areas. So when we think about elevation, the American Society of Civil Engineers 24-14, section 1.5.2 has elevation requirements. And again, it allows for dry floodproofing of non-residential and non-residential portions of a mixed-use building below the base flood elevation, plus specified freeboard or designed flood elevation, whichever is higher, provided the dry floodproofing measures meet the requirements in Chapter 6. So again, this complements the NFIP requirements. And now with elevation, portions of a mixed-use building that are below the base flood elevation plus a specified freeboard or the designed flood elevation, whichever is higher, again, has to meet those requirements. And there was a change in the flood design class 4 buildings in ASCE 24-05 to be elevated or protected to the BFE plus 2 feet, or the design flood elevation, or the 500-year flood elevation, whichever is highest.
Hey,
I
Amy.
think that's a good standard to have additional higher elevation.
Hey, Amy, just want to give everyone a quick update. So in the chat while Amy was presenting, I dropped some links in the chat box for you guys. The first link is a P936. So now where you guys could reference it is the floodproofing non-residential building. This one came out in 2013. So now where you guys could go on there and download a copy for yourself. That's a good document to have. The second link I drop is the FEMA Technical Bulletin 3 that talks about the floodproofing requirements and certification. So now where you guys know if someone submits something to you, how to review it and how to ensure that you get the correct certification. And then the last one I dropped in here is the most recent FEMA flood insurance manual as it pertains to Risk Rating 2.0. When we do get to the insurance section for dry flood proofing, all those documentation that Amy is alluding to, the emergency operations plan, the maintenance plan, plus the certification, all that stuff has to be submitted to get the discount for flood insurance for dry flood proofing the building to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot of freeboard. So those are just some good information to have. So now you guys have it in your back pocket when it comes to dry flood proofing certification. So, but the manual is up to date. It's the one effective October 1st, 2022. And it kind of goes over Risk Rating 2.0 and all the implications for like discounts for all the topics as well. But I just want you guys to have those documents while Amy is presenting. So just want to put that plug in for you, Amy.
Hey, Amy, also, this is Amanda. Are you guys going to be sending out these slides to us after the class?
Yes.
Hey, Amanda, we sent, I responded to your message. Yeah, we sent it out as a PDF due to the size limit. So it'll be sent out as a PDF.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I did not see it in the chat.
I'm sorry. You good.
Okay. Thank you.
And you had one other question while we're there. Someone asked about CEC credit for today. PDH/CEC. I'm not sure what's PDH.
Professional
Is that development
hours.
Okay. Someone asked about it. Steve asked about it.
We'll address that at the end. But if you have your name and your community in the chat, we do give certificates for attendance. Again, you have to attend the whole entire session. You can't just be on for 5 minutes and then expect a certificate. So we do track how long you're on. If you hop on and hop off multiple times, you won't get a certificate. But if you're on here the whole time, you'll get a certificate. Okay. So dry floodproofing, this is additional information on dry floodproofing. So it does permit for dry floodproofing of non-residential buildings and non-residential portions of mixed-use buildings when the buildings are located outside a high-risk flood area. And then making sure that you have techniques that make the structures substantially impermeable and requires the use of flood damage resistant materials, except on the interior of the structures, requiring sump pumps to remove water that accumulates from the passage of vapor and seepage during flooding, and it limits dry floodproofing to flood hazard areas with flood velocities that are less than or equal to 5 feet per second during the design flood. I thought this was fascinating because I've never ever seen any kind of design flood information and a floodproofing certificate. But if you are a floodplain administrator, you should be asking for this information to see what the flood velocities are going to be in the area, or how fast it could accumulate in an area. And then making sure that you require walls below the minimum elevations of dry floodproofing to use table 6-1. And again, this is in the American Society of Civil Engineering 24-14 section 6.2 on dry floodproofing. So in addition, you want to make sure, as we talked about before, that you require walls, floors, flood shields to resist hydrostatic, hydrodynamic, and other flood loads. And another thing that we don't talk enough about is soil or fill adjacent to the structure must be compacted and protected from erosion and scour, and requiring that at least one door, window, or other opening for emergency escape and rescue to be above the elevation. So like we talked about earlier, the engineer is going to be doing the design standards. There should be a surveyor that's in consultation to have elevation information regarding the door, the window, the opening for emergency escape and rescue. And then also specify several limitations when human intervention is necessary to activate or implement dry floodproofing measures. So if there is going to be human intervention, that has to be detailed as well, and how that's going to be taking place. And it is a change from ASCE 24-05. It does not require flood damage resistant materials on the interior of dry floodproof portions of the building. So comparison, it does exceed 44 Code of Federal Regulations 60.3 C3 with more specificity, except that the NFIP requires the use of flood damage resistant materials in areas where seepage can accumulate, and FEMA deems that temporarily installed means of flood protection that cover walls are inconsistent with the requirement that the walls be substantially impermeable. So then it has within the document additional information where it has the ASCE interpretation of the ASCE 24-14 flood shield requirements and FEMA position on whether a flood shield configuration meets the NFIP dry floodproofing requirements on page 10. So flood insurance. One of the things that has always fascinated me in life is that sometimes when people are doing a project, or they're buying a car, or they're buying a house, one entity that should always be consulted on the front end is your insurance agent, right? Like my neighbor Amy bought a new car years ago, and I said, how much is the car insurance? She was complaining about buying a new car, and I said, well, how much is your insurance going to be a month? And she goes, I don't know, I'm just getting in the car. That's not a good kind of method to go in life, because you want to know how much your insurance is going to be, so you know how much to allocate in your budget. The same sort of thing if you're dry floodproofing a structure. Sometimes people complain about the cost of flood insurance, that it's really high, or you have a homeowner that bought a house and they didn't know it was in the floodplain, and all of a sudden they have a mortgage payment and a flood insurance payment that they want, you know, all 12 months paid for up front, and nobody told them. So you want to make sure that an insurance agent with NFIP experience should be consulted during the design phase of the buildings with dry floodproofing to estimate the cost of what flood insurance will be. That's just something kind of simple, because again, if you're consulting, if there's different measures or different activities that you can do to a building to try to reduce that amount and maybe safeguard your building a little bit more, that's definitely advantageous over the life of a loan. If someone's buying a commercial structure and they're floodproofing it, if you do additional measures where you can lower that rate, that's good. And if the insurance agent doesn't have a lot of experience with the NFIP, there's also the FEMA Office of the Flood Insurance Advocate, where they can get help and information when they're trying to determine the cost of flood insurance, especially with dry floodproofing if they don't have much experience with that. So there can be a dry floodproofing credit. The NFIP flood insurance rating procedures provide credit for dry floodproofing only if the dry floodproofing measures are certified to be at least 1 foot above the BFE, even if that level of protection is not required by local floodplain management regulations. So whenever Julius and I talk to someone that's doing a floodproofing certificate, we always try to bring this up to folks to get that credit, because that could be substantial over the life of a loan, just to make sure that's elevated 1 foot above. And then the other thing too, if you're looking at flood damage, again, the higher you go, the better, because it's going to be harder for the water to accumulate in the building. So this is just something to think about, that you can get a credit through insurance rating procedures.
Yeah, and to reinforce what Amy said about insurance, you have to provide all that documentation to the insurance agent, the dry flood proofing certificate, the emergency operations plan, the inspection plan. So that's why I put you guys that link for the flood insurance manual. So that way you can direct, if a client or customer developer is coming to you guys and saying, hey, what do I need to do to get credit for doing the dry flood proofing? Then you could reference them to the flood insurance manual so they could see exactly what is needed to provide it for them to get credit for insurance for the NFIP program. So everything that we're giving you guys is just giving you guys the tools to access information. So if there's additional follow-up questions, the individual could look it up themselves, or they could reach out to Amy and I and Cheyenne, and we could have a conversation with you guys as well. We try to be very inclusive, especially when we have office hours on Mondays. We want you guys to be part of the conversation. So if you're working on a project, whether it's dry flood proofing or non-dry flood proofing, and you have questions, and the homeowner or the property owner or the developer has questions, you could schedule office hours with us, and we'll sit down and talk about it as a team. So that way everyone's on the same page, and we're just managing expectations from the beginning of the project till the very end. So in that way, you don't have a situation where someone's coming in and say, hey, I want to do all these things, do it, and then we come back and say, hey, you have a violation for the community. So our goal is to be very proactive and have you guys engage with us from the beginning. So kind of changing how we do floodplain in Tennessee, where we want you guys to be part of the process from the beginning with us, with myself, Amy, Cheyenne, and you guys. So now we could have conversations together. Amy, you good?
No, I'm great. No, we have Monday office hours. We have met with several communities. We have two that can come to mind. I won't say who, that we've had many Monday conversations about different things. So we're always available. Just reach out if you have a question. We'll be more than happy to help you. But again, if you're struggling or you feel overwhelmed or frustrated, we are here to help you. You have a great team in Tennessee, and so be more than happy to work with you guys. We think about risk rating 2.0, the methodology used to determine.
I mean, your slides went blank. We're not seeing anything.
I can see it.
Yeah, we're not seeing on our end. Well, I'm not seeing on my end, so I don't know if anyone else is not seeing it either.
You see it?
I don't see anything. I see a blank screen because you were showing something else, like a CAD screen of an email.
Yeah, we cannot see the screen.
See it now.
Yep, you could just switch into presentation. Yep.
See it now.
Yep, you good.
Great. Okay, so we're talking about risk rating 2.0. Again, the methodology used is going to be under that new methodology. So it may be a little bit harder right now until insurance agents understand this new methodology. But again, the Office of the Flood Insurance Advocate can help. So whether buildings are new construction designed to be dry flood proofed, or you have an existing building that's considering dry flood proofing for retrofitting, you want to make sure that there's that you have compliance with your floodplain management regulations and design requirements, and that you reduce flood damage below the flood protection level. And again, you want to provide safety of personnel responsible for deployment of components that require human intervention. And again, it has to be feasible to implement, maintain, and operate, and making sure that you use allowable recommended cleaning after the flood events. So, you know, a lot of times we think about dry floodproofing a building, there's different measures that are used. And we were talking about how 80% of the time dry floodproofing measures fail. And that's because a lot of the times the certification documentation that's given to a local floodplain administrator is missing various pieces and parts. And so if an engineer doesn't do all the design standards and doesn't take all these various elements into consideration, the building can flood. And then the question is, what type of cleaning am I going to have to do to my building after a flood event? What kind of money am I looking at? How much disruption of my business am I going to have after this flood event? So something to really take into consideration when you, someone is designing dry floodproofing for a building, to make sure that you kind of look at all these different kind of elements as far as, am I going to have active or passive floodproofing? How much human intervention, safety of my employees, or being able to get to the building, and then making sure that you have a level of residual risk that's accepted by the owner. Because you can't necessarily, if I'm a business, let's say that I have Miller Bakery and my building is dry floodproofed, if my engineer doesn't look at all this information, I may have a false sense of security that my building's never ever going to flood. So someone should be talking to me saying, hey, Amy, you have your bakery, you can make all your goods every day, but also know that even though you have these different measures to try to protect your building against flooding, there's still a level of risk that something may fail and you may your building may flood. So again, making sure to communicate risk is kind of like with floodplain management. When we were at the conference and I asked how many of you guys talk about floodplain management to your local communities, and we had 100 people in the room and only 3 people raised their hand. There's not there needs to be improvement as far as communication on the value of floodplain management regulations, the value of having a floodproofing certificate, and the various elements that need to be addressed. And then also communicating that risk to the property owner, or the, let's say it's a lessee of the building or the owner, to make sure that they understand that just because this building is dry floodproofed, it may or may not flood in the future, but you need to be aware of that and make sure that you're taking steps to try to address that. So again, site-specific hazards. Every single site has specific flood hazards to it. So again, looking at those different kind of hazards are going to influence the design of the floodproofing measures. How vulnerable is the building to flooding? And how well are these floodproofing measures going to perform during a flood event? So flood vulnerability, and again, you're going to examine the site conditions and the existing building, the vulnerability of architectural and structural systems, the building envelope, and the utility systems. So again, you want to look at all these different pieces to see how vulnerable are they going to be in a flood event. How is does my building have foundation issues? Does it have cracks? How easy would water seep into the structure? So kind of looking at doing an assessment before you start this dry floodproofing or floodproofing certificate, to make sure that you understand the vulnerability of the building and assessing that at the front end. And then active dry floodproofing is going to require human intervention. So I'm going to have to go out and install this floodgate to my front door or a window before the onset of flooding. And passive floodproofing measures do not require human intervention. So one place that I saw was in Knoxville over at Fountain City. They had when I first started my career as being the state coordinator, Roy McClure and I went over to McDonald's, and they actually had a floodgate that would come up from the ground to the front of the building. So it would go halfway up the front door, and we took pictures of it. And then we had the McDonald's manager come out to the parking lot asking us what we were doing, and we had to show ID. So it was kind of interesting being, you know, new to the job and just going out and looking at floodplain areas and looking at floodproofing mechanism and asking to see ID. So looking at residual risk. Residual risk is the remaining exposure to loss after the design floodproofing measures have been implemented. Losses, as we talked about today, could be higher than expected. So again, communicating flood risk and understanding that even though you've designed it for a certain level, if you have an event where, let's say you have a Waverly type event where it floods, it could be much more than what you ever fathomed, and just making sure that you think about this and try to prepare. So if there is a dry floodproofing system failure, the common causes are unidentified points of entry for floodwater, poorly maintained components. So as we talked about before, having a maintenance plan, and then making sure that components with insufficient resistance to flood loads, and failure to implement active measures that require human intervention, especially if it's a complex system. So you want to make sure that whoever is in charge with doing the active measures understands how to implement those features prior to a flood event. So flood hazards and site conditions, there should be an assessment to look at the depth of flooding, the rate of flood water rise and fall, what's the frequency of flooding in a community, the duration, and possible debris impacts. One of the things that'll probably always stick out in my mind is when we toured Waverly 4 days after the flood, just to see the various debris impacts and where someone's home come off the foundation or their storage shed hit someone else's house, or cars that were up into other houses or upright leaning up against the house. But again, thinking about debris impact is something that we don't give enough time and attention to in a community. If there is a flood event, making sure that things are anchored and elevated so it's not flying torpedoes. Flood warning time is an important factor when considering active dry floodproofing measures. And really it's the length of time between the recognition that flooding may occur and when floodwaters begin to affect a site. So there should be warning issued by credible sources to provide enough time. So again, if you have a weather radio, if you have an app on your phone, or if there's gauges in a community where you can see that river levels are rising, but just making sure that you think about flood warning time. So the first step is determine the flood warning time and site specific, and then next is to determine whether the flood warning time is going to be sufficient. And then the designer is considering, so there is, you got to think about that, because a lot of times in communities you have roads and different kind of infrastructures that are below the BFE. So you can see in this picture, if I have a flood event and let's say I was at home, it's a weekend, and all of a sudden somebody calls me and says, hey, Amy, come in and put this floodgate up. And then I'm trying to get to the site and all of a sudden I'm driving through floodwaters. I'm not going to have enough time to get to my bakery and put the gate up, right? So again, you want to think about how you're going to get to the site, how you're going to implement that if there is a flood warning in the community. So large rivers and waterways may take hours, days, or weeks for floodwaters to crest. Smaller watersheds in mountain and hilly areas can have flash flooding with very little or no warning time before the onset. So for dry floodproofing measures, they have to be active or passive. And as we talked about a moment ago, active measures require human intervention if I'm going to install, deploy, or otherwise activate. And building owners and designers should consider passive measures because of the effectiveness. It doesn't depend upon human intervention. It doesn't depend upon me trying to drive through flooded roads to get to my business. And examples of passive measures could be design doors that are always sealed when closed, design windows, flood shields that are designed to automatically close when triggered by rising flood water on the site. So that's the example we were talking about, McDonald's in Knoxville. So flood warning time is key because you want to make sure that you address floodwaters that are going to reach the flood protection level, but the time it takes for flooding to begin to affect the site and reach a point where water enters the building if dry floodproofing measures have not been deployed. So again, trying to get to your building to protect it So there are some active dry floodproofing measures. We see a lot of these in various proposals. And again, it should recognize a threat, whether anticipated storm conditions will have high winds that could hamper installation. And then how are you going to notify the person or the contractor responsible for installation or deployment? Travel time, locate, activate, deploy, and install the measures. And it could require moving heavy equipment, not typically on the site, such as forklifts, and then making sure that you evacuate people, implementing the measures using predetermined evacuation routes, and taking into account whether roads or bridges are closed. So again, we have to think about all these different things. So when we talked about earlier, looking at site-specific information, every single site has unique flooding concerns. And so you want to make sure that you have all those addressed, especially when you have active dry floodproofing measures and you're depending upon a person to come and try to floodproof the building with different measures. So again, functional use of the buildings, the spaces within them must be evaluated, the location, the purpose, and the frequency of use of entrances. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Do you have a front door? Do you have a back door? Do you have doors on the side? How many entrances do you have? And if you're going to be floodproofing the building, do you have enough, let's say, active measures for all those different areas? Does someone know? Let's say I'm on vacation and Cheyenne's going to be the one putting up floodgates. Does she know where all the floodgates are at? Does she know the locations? Does she know how to install all those? And if, let's say that she does, but she has to get a forklift, are you going to be able to get the forklift to the building to be able to install all the heavy equipment? All those things should be addressed within the certification, and then making sure that the building owner understands these measures that should be used if you're renting it to someone. So for mixed use buildings, they have additional functional use considerations, because if there's separate access must be provided to the elevated residential portions of these buildings. When there's shared access, like a lobby to residential and non-residential portions are dry flood proofed. And when separate access to the residential portions of a mixed use building is enclosed by walls, the walls must comply with the requirements for enclosures below elevated buildings, sometimes called wet floodproofing. So dry floodproofing a building for safety, it should not be occupied during flood conditions. So you want to make sure they have safety and access considerations, especially when you have mixed use buildings. Do you have some sort of warning to tell residents that they need to leave the building? Do they understand how to get out of there for an evacuation route? And making sure that flooding may rise higher than the flood protection level, or dry floodproofing component systems may fail, endangering occupants. So again, it's important that if there is a dry floodproof building and there is mixed use, that the occupants in those upper levels understand when there's a flood event, what to do, and the inherent risk that if some of the utility systems fail, that if they're up, let's say in a high rise, that they may have to be going down the steps because the elevators don't work and different things like that. So required plans. So we want to put this in red because buildings that will be dry flood proofed should have both flood emergency operation plans and inspection and maintenance plans. It's not something we've seen a whole lot here in Tennessee, but again, when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So you want to make sure that you have flood emergency operation plans and inspection and maintenance plans available. So again, applicants are required to submit these plans along with construction documentation, design certifications as part of an application for a building permit. So as we talked about before, Julius came up with a really good slogan. Was it last week? Yeah, it was last week. So it came up with RAD, right? So maybe y'all, we should have t-shirts that say, "Are you rad?" And then it can be review, assess, and document. So one of the things is if someone's doing a floodproofing certificate, you want to make sure that before you issue a building permit, that you review to make sure that there's a flood emergency operations plan, there's an inspection plan, a maintenance plan, and to make sure that it's compliant with floodplain management regulations, and also to have your building code inspector look at it as well to make sure that it complies with building code standards. So required plans, emergency operation plans, and inspection and maintenance plans are required to be submitted with the applications for NFIP flood insurance coverage to receive credit. So like Julia said earlier, that when someone's trying to get credit, you have to have documentation of these measures and have that submitted when the policy is going to be rated. If there's no plans with that, you're not going to get that discount. So looking at emergency operation plan, I'm not going to read all this, but again, you want to make sure that you have personnel, equipment, tools, and supplies ready, and that you have a clear chain of command. Who's in charge for deploying these active dry floodproofing measures, right? And then making sure that they know how to install them. What's the sequence? What's the timeline? Who's responsible? And then also having written descriptions. So you may have, an operations plan on, let's say that I'm the person that has to install the floodgates. There should be a notebook or instructions on how to install these measures, a map. Just like I was talking about earlier, Cheyenne has to install 4 different gates, or floodgates for the doors. Does she understand? If it's a large building, does she understand the location of where these measures are stored, the locations of all the doors, and again, making sure that there's equipment and tools and materials ready for that installation. Because one thing if you can find the gates, but if you don't have that forklift, if it's super heavy, or let's say you're missing tools to install that, if they're not readily available with the active dry floodproofing measures, you're in trouble. Your building's going to flood. Maybe a little bit quicker than if you had it easier. So again, making sure that you have instructions for installing and deploying. You have repair procedures and components maintenance procedures. Again, if my utility systems get inundated with the accumulation of floodwaters, what am I going to do? And then instructions for connecting emergency power source. Do I have an emergency power source? And then making sure that I contact information for the manufacturer and designer to expedite obtaining replacement parts. That's another thing I don't think people think about a lot of times. If you have different utility facilities that get damaged, who do you call to get them fixed? And then making sure that you have requirements for installation and deployment drills. So inspection and maintenance, there should be a comprehensive plan for these for the entire dry floodproofing system, and to ensure that the system components, measures, materials, and equipment required for the system to function are inspected and maintained periodically. And again, the design professionals have to design and certify and should prepare the inspection and maintenance plans. And it is a good rule of thumb to make sure that the building owners or operators are engaged with the design professionals to coordinate regular inspections and address deficiencies during inspections. So again, it's one of those things that just because you have it doesn't mean it's just sit in the back of a dark closet or hallway and never ever see the light of day. You want to make sure that you have inspection and maintenance plans to look at these to make sure that your building doesn't have an interruption from a flood event because you didn't know how to use the active floodproofing measures correctly. So again, you want to have a regular schedule. You want to make sure you have manufacturer manuals available because they do provide recommendations for aspects that need to be checked. And then you may even want to have something on a calendar where you have a frequency of inspections and ordering information for replacement parts. Again, the floodproofing certificate lists the minimum information, but again, you want to make sure that you have inspection plans, you have maintenance plans in order to obtain flood insurance coverage. So for some of you guys that maybe will get a floodproofing certificate in the future, you can't just get that certificate and they sign it and it's blank, right? There has to be additional information in there, design standards, certifications, elevation information, inspection plans, maintenance plans, emergency operation plans, and making sure that all the various elements are addressed. So again, making sure that you have a comprehensive inspection and maintenance plan, Again, what's the exterior envelope of the structure, such as wall and foundation systems, and then identify possible structural and waterproofing deficiencies. Again, do I have cracks? Do I have water staining? Is there areas where flood water can penetrate my building? If I have a slab on grade or wall, the slab joints, including structural and drainage deficiencies. If I'm using flood shields, gates, panels, doors, glazing, and other components. Again, what kind of hardware and tools am I going to be using? Fasteners. If I have sump pumps and interior drain systems, what level of event is that going to work? And then if I have to have an emergency generator, do I know how to use it? Do I have a fuel source with it? And other drainage measures for the structure. So again, backflow, non-return valves, shut-off valves, and then I should know where the location of all my active dry flood proofing components are located, right? And then having a cadence of inspection and maintenance plan. Again, inspection and maintenance plans should be done at least once a year. So again, certified as-built drawings. The certificate requires a registered design professional, such as an engineer or architect, to certify these dry flood proofing measures. Again, it should be in accordance with American Society of Civil Engineer 24 or its equivalent. And again, it has to have as-built drawings for construction and physical inspection. So again, it should be signed, sealed, and delivered to the floodplain administrator's office. The other day we were looking at an engineering analysis for a bridge, and the engineer just kind of took a pen and paper and drew the bridge, but it wasn't signed, sealed. It didn't have the vertical datum. So again, when you get these plans and stuff, if you're an engineer, your work is really your reputation. So you want to make sure that whenever you're submitting something to a floodplain administrator, that you identify all the different pieces and parts that should be submitted, and then making sure that it's signed, that it's sealed, that it's certified, and that whatever you're sending to the floodplain administrator, that everything is identified, clearly marked, so that a floodplain administrator can go, yes, I have the inspection plan. Yes, I have the maintenance plan. Yes, I have the design standards. I have the elevation information, right? I have information on utilities. I have information on the floodgates. All those pieces of the puzzle should be marked, and it should be clear. So if someone's reviewing it, they know that they have everything, because sometimes people don't always do that, and it makes reviewing and it makes the process of getting your building permit that much harder when you're missing various pieces. So again, making sure that you're organized and you have a uniform submittal package that's clear to everyone is really appreciated. So again, determining the flood design class. The flood design class is based on the use or occupancy of a building or structure, and the risk to the public should the building be damaged or the occupancy function being impaired by flooding. And again, this is table 1 of American Society of Civil Engineers 24 that defines the 4 different flood classes. So again, once you determine the flood class, and you're going to determine the flood protection level, structures must be watertight, substantially impermeable, below the base flood level or the BFE. The minimum flood protection level for flood design class 2 and class 3 buildings is a BFE, base flood elevation, plus 1 foot, or the design flood elevation, whichever is higher. The minimum flood protection level for flood design class 4 considered critical and essential facilities. So it could be like a hospital, nursing home, is the highest of the base flood elevation plus 2 feet, or the design flood elevation, or the 500-year flood elevation. And for flood design class 1, it includes temporary structures, accessory structures, small parking structures, and certain agricultural structures. It requires flood protection 2 BFE, base flood elevation plus 1 foot, or the design flood elevation, whichever is higher. So again, this kind of complements what Julius was talking about earlier, as far as when you're looking at determining what the flood insurance rate is going to be. You really want to have that elevation be above the base flood elevation so you can get that credit. So again, this just complements that requirement that we talked about earlier. And for design flood elevation in American Society of Civil Engineers 24, defines the term design flood and design flood elevation to account for communities that elect to adopt flood hazard maps based on floods that are higher than the base flood, the 1% annual chance, or to include areas not shown on the flood insurance rate maps. And then adding that freeboard above the BFE as an additional factor of safety is a common practice for establishing the minimum elevation requirement. So really, when communities just simply adopt the flood insurance rate maps, they can have that base flood elevation for regulatory purposes, and the design flood elevation can be used the same as a base flood elevation. So again, the building codes and the NFIP regulations really complement each other, and they go hand in hand when you're looking at design flood elevations. So again, it's important whenever there's going to be dry flood proofing to make sure that you look at the building, the type of use, and making sure that that design flood class we talked about a moment ago, 1 through 4, that you're making sure that the elevation requirements that are listed within these guidelines are being upheld. So additional steps to take when a flood insurance rate map panel doesn't show base flood elevation, or when detailed elevation information isn't available, you can go to other sources to try to determine the base flood elevation. So as we talked about before, you can go to a state source. Let's say you go to TDOT. If it's, let's say the building is near a bridge and they have base flood elevation information. You can go federal. You can go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You can go through FEMA. If you have base level engineering, so if you are Sullivan County or Giles County, you have that information that can be used to determine the base flood elevation. Or if the building is in a floodway or encroaching a stream, you can have an engineering analysis, hydraulic and hydrologic study to determine the base flood elevation. So again, step 3, determining flood loads. You're going to determine the flood loads that would act on a building at the selected location. And for design purposes, the flood loads are the result of the floodwater rising to the flood protection level and moving past an object such as a building or a component of a building. And then flood loads are discussed in American Society of Civil Engineering, Chapter 7, which should be the primary source for calculating flood loads. So again, you're really going to be looking at the water and how it's going to be acting on the building and kind of the location of the flow, and whether you have frontal impact on the upstream side, the drag effect, and then looking at the negative pressure and suction on the downstream side. So there are 4 types of flood loads: hydrostatic, including buoyancy, which is a vertical hydrostatic force resulting from the displacement of any given volume of floodwater; hydrodynamic, wave loads. We don't have to worry about that so much here because we're not a coastal state, but impact loads, and then load combinations, which are a combination of all the types of loads. So those are various steps within the guidance document. So think about hydrostatic loads. You think about the flood water that's imposed by standing water on an object or building. And again, hydrostatic loads on specific buildings are determined using the flood protection level and must be applied to all building surfaces, both above and below the ground surface. When we think about vertical hydrostatic force, when we think about buoyancy, it can be determined by multiplying the specific weight of the water and the volume of the flood water displaced by a submerged object. So a lot of times if you're thinking about like a cup of water and you're thinking about that vertical level and you put a tennis ball in there and it kind of bobs a little bit, you think about buoyancy. And so buoyant forces act upward on the bottom of the foundation walls and base slabs and are resisted by the weight of the building and the structure capacity of the slab to resist the uplift loads. So when flood shields are included in dry floodproofing systems to prevent flood water from entering openings in the building envelope, such as windows and doors, the shields must extend up to at least the flood protection level. So again, we're talking about those different design standards, whether it's the BFE plus 1 foot or the design flood elevation, or let's say you're doing the 500-year or beyond that, you're going to want to make sure that those shields extend up to at least that protection level. So it really should always be above the BFE at least 1 foot. And a common practice is to extend it an additional foot so that even if small amounts of a splash or overtopping of a shield could result in a significant volume of flood water entering the building. So again, they should be designed to resist hydrostatic upload applied over the entire shield, and it should be a continuous load path through the mounting systems to the walls and ultimately foundations. So hydrodynamic loads are imposed by the water flowing around a fixed object such as a building. And again, you're going to be looking at the function of the flow velocity and the geometry of the object or the building. Upstream surfaces receive positive frontal pressures, side surfaces experience the effects of drag, and the downstream surfaces have negative suction pressure. So the American Society of Civil Engineers, Section 24, Chapter 6, limits the use of dry floodproofing to areas where the flood velocities are less than or equal to 5 feet per second. So again, local, state, and federal agencies and the floodway data tables and the flood insurance studies developed for waterways where FEMA provided detailed analysis are potential sources of velocity information. So a lot of times, like we talked about before, the flood insurance studies have additional detailed flooding information. So the engineer or architect, when they're doing design standards, should be looking at this to see what the flood velocities are at the specific site that they're designing for. So we look at impact loads. Impact loads result from debris that's transported by floodwater and strikes the building. So we talked about before, debris can be a whole lot of things, right? It could be trees, it could be sheds, it could be vehicles, it could be material from other damaged buildings. And especially when you look at some of the images from Florida right now or Puerto Rico, the magnitude of those impact loads is difficult to predict due to the uncertainty and size and the weight of the objects. So you can prepare for many things, but if you have a significant flood event, you're not going to be able to necessarily protect against everything. But again, you want to try and do your best to look at the area around there and identify some of the magnitude of the impact loads if you can. So performing a condition assessment of existing structures, the first step is to do a visual examination of the building. So a lot of times we talk about whenever there's development in the floodplain, the floodplain administrator should be going out to the site, because sometimes there's an unmapped stream or different issues occurring on the site that if you just look at what's drawn on a piece of paper for the site plan, you may be missing different elements. The same thing can be said for floodproofing a structure. So if you have an engineer that you're hiring to doing a floodproofing certificate, that individual should be going out and doing an examination and inspection of the building, right? To make sure, as we talked about before, does it have cracks in the foundation? Does it have cracks in the wall? Can water easily penetrate the building? Because they have to go out and kind of look at that and assess that right off the bat. The second step is to do a more thorough assessment and a review of the as-built drawings and any plans or other documents related to any kind of modifications of the structural elements after initial construction. And again, if there's cracks and penetrations, they must be identified and examined to determine whether they would become pathways for seepage. And the assessment results should be documented in written reports. So it's kind of like you want to go out and assess the building. You want to look at some of the deficiencies of the building, and then you're also going to have an assessment of how you're going to deal with those and how you're going to fix those various issues. And it may take extra time and money, but again, if I'm going to be the building owner and it's my livelihood, all these different issues should be addressed. And then performing a condition assessment to make sure that the modifications to the existing structures are going to satisfy dry floodproofing performance requirements. And modification in key areas to include strengthening structural walls or floor systems, sealing wall penetrations, installing waterproof membranes, and where are flood shields going to be located, where are they needed, right? The same thing with seepage. Where is it going to accumulate, and are there going to be some pumps needed? So again, all these things should be part of the condition assessment. And another thing, if soil boring information for the site is not available, there should be a geotechnical investigation to determine the lateral earth pressures and allowable soil bearing capacities. So essentially, when you're doing a geotechnical study, you're going to be looking at to see if the soil is compatible with what you're proposing to do at the site. Because as we talked about before, a lot of times in Tennessee, there's sinkholes and other issues where a geotechnical survey can tell you if the soil is suitable at the site. And if it isn't suitable, maybe you go to another area. Because again, you want to make sure that there's consideration whether or not there's a presence of expansive or collapsible soil, if there's a potential for scour, permeability, and compaction behavior. Now, some communities have compaction requirements for engineered fill, others do not, but this is something that should be part of the initial assessment. Design or check structural components for resistance to flood loads. After all the flood loads have been determined in step 3 for existing buildings, the condition has assessed, and step 4, the design professional should next demonstrate that the structural elements of walls, the foundation slabs within the areas to be dry flood proof have to have adequate strength to resist flood loads. And again, to comply with the regulations, the structural components of new construction must be designed in accordance with American Society of Civil Engineer 7 to resist combined flood and other loads like dead load, live load, wind loads, seismic loads. So structural components such as exterior walls, foundation elements, and diaphragms could experience substantial increases in loads. So you're going to, after dry flood proofing measures are applied. So exterior walls commonly require strengthening with supplemental vertical or horizontal structural members to resist flood loads. Because if you're not enforcing the walls and there's a flood event, or you put up those gates and things, you could have cracks and penetrations below the flood protection level, and they should be sealed to limit seepage during flooding. And another aspect is whether the building elements such as the slab have adequate resistance to uplift caused by buoyancy. So evaluating building utility systems and equipment. And as we talked about multiple times today, you want to make sure that you locate building utility systems and equipment above the flood protection level. So we talked about here in this picture, we see this all the time when we go out and do floodplain tours. Is it the HVAC units, the compressor is not elevated and anchored above the base flood elevation. And so building utility systems and equipment that serve non-residential buildings or non-residential portions of mixed-use buildings should either be flood-proofed, and if the flood-proofing systems fail or are overtopped by flood water rising above the flood protection level, then those systems are going to be damaged and they're not going to be repairable, and it could contribute to the loss of functionability of a building. So again, when you're doing the site assessment, if you notice that some of these utility systems are not above the base flood elevation, then maybe you look at that flood design standard and you elevate those, or you flood proof them so that you don't have that seepage going into them. Excuse me. When you're evaluating building utility systems and equipment, you want to make sure as part of the NFIP regulations and the American Society of Civil Engineers 24, permit equipment and service facilities to be below the flood protection level, that they're designed to prevent water from entering and accumulating within the components. The expectation is that after being submerged, the equipment and facilities below the flood protection level will be able to be restored to functioning with minimal cleaning and repair. So just because you have something that's below the base flood elevation, it has to be flood-proofed, waterproofed, to make sure that that water can't get into those elements. And then after a flood event, that those systems are going to have minimal or no damage, and they're going to be up and running almost immediately. That's one thing that I think a lot of people don't think about enough, that especially if you have a mixed use building and you have residents who are living on upper floors of a building, if there is a flood event and it doesn't necessarily affect their unit, they're going to want to be able to come back in the building and not have any real interruption of their lives. So design and specify flood shields. Again, if you're going to be using doors, windows, or other openings below the flood protection level, design professionals have to design and specify flood shields so that the system performs as intended. And again, if it's going to perform as intended, there has to be documentation of how that's all going to work, right? And then you're also going to want to finalize those designs, and then they're going to determine what's the warning time and the likely availability of personnel to deploy those active dry floodproofing measures. So just because you have a gate and it is below the BFE or the design flood elevation, you've got to take into account if somebody has to go in and put that gate up, how much time do they need to do that, and making sure that it gets deployed quickly. So flood shields have to be strong enough to resist all the imposed flood loads. And it's critical to determine if it's going to be mounted on structural elements of a building or a door or window frame. Do you have the correct type of equipment to and tools to make sure that once it's mounted on there, it's going to stay on there, and that you have all the resources you need to put that on there in a flood event. And then designers should make sure that they're tested and certified to the American National Standard Institute Flood Mitigation 2510, section 3.3 of this technical bulletin has additional information. So step 8, design waterproofing system. Design professionals need to ensure the areas below the flood protection level are watertight and substantially impermeable. And again, you want to limit seepage through the walls, through the floors, through the utility joints, cracks, and around the flood shields. Again, and the system must not allow more than 4 inches of water depth from seepage to accumulate during a 24-hour period without relying on devices to remove the flood water. So that's something that's important.
Hey, Amy, stay on this design page for a minute. We did have a situation the other day. Just want to let you guys know about it. When you're doing compliance, because I know sometimes folks kind of, when they think about the design for the dry flood proofing, they're trying to find alternative measures for dry flood proofing. So we had a particular developer who wanted to do some tiger dams or things that's temporary barriers. Those are not dry flood proofing. So if it's not attached to the building, like the flood gates, the flood barriers, those are not in compliance with NFIP program. So those would be like sandbags, tiger dams, those inflatable barriers that you put up around a structure to prevent water from entering the structure. Those are emergency measures. Those do not function as dry flood proofing. So if you do have somebody that's coming with an alternative idea, say, hey, can I use this for dry flood proofing? It's non-compliant with the NFIP program. So we had the situation just a few weeks ago, and we had to explain like levee walls, building a levee wall around a structure, putting tiger dams, or instead of putting sandbags, those are not dry flood proofing. So dry flood proofing has to be physically attached to the building, like the barriers, flood gates, flood shields. Those things has to be secured to the building and make sure it doesn't allow water into the structure. So if it's a temporary barrier that they put around it and they want to submit that as certification for dry flood proofing, that's non-compliant. So just be on the heads up as folks come in with different options, because dry flood proofing is expensive. So sometimes folks try to kind of come up with a roundabout to not have to spend the cost of dry flood proofing. But yeah, those things are not NFIP compliant. So just be on the heads up if you're dealing with engineers or property owners who are trying to use those measures for dry flood proofing. They don't count for floodplain compliance. And basically you create a violation for the community if you allow that for dry flood proofing.
Thank you. That's a very good point. See, like when we have our Monday office hours, we never know what we're going to get. And so we just had that recent, and Julius was really great to work with the community and talk to the engineer about that. So step 9 talks about design interior drainage. Most spaces below the flood protection level of dry flood-proof buildings will not stay completely dry during a flood event. So therefore, the interior drainage system should be designed to limit the accumulation of seepage. So design should specify the path along where the seepage is going to flow, collect, and where drains and pumps are going to be installed. And then the American Society of Civil Engineers 24 requires the use of sump pumps to remove accumulation due to any passage of water and seepage of water during flood events. And then again, you want to make sure that the final step in the process is to make sure that the registered engineer or architect certifies the designs. And then this is just an example of the floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures. Again, this talks about how the floodproofing of non-residential buildings are permitted as an alternative to elevating to or above base flood elevation. You have to have a floodproofing certificate as part of the development permit process. It has to be used for certification. So again, all the different elements we talked about for the last hour and a half have to be done. So number A talks about entering the building owner's name and address of the building. So the other thing is section 1 talks about flood insurance rate map information, having a community number. It's kind of like a community social security number for NFIP. You want to have the panel number, the suffix, the date, the firm zone, and then what is the base flood elevation. And again, the base flood elevation has to be the location of the building. Again, as we talked about earlier, if it's a zone AE, you're going to use a flood insurance study profile. If it's a zone A, you're going to have the elevation above the highest adjacent grade. And then again, you're going to have the elevation datum and D to talk about what you use, and that should be reflective and identical to the elevation datum used for the flood insurance rate map. And then you have these other sections here where you have the building is flood proof to an elevation of for E, and then F, you're going to have the datum. G is going to be the height, the flood proofing of the building above the lowest adjacent grade. And then H is going to be the highest adjacent grade, finished grade next to the building. And then I, you're going to have that datum. And then you have instructions here about for unnumbered A zones, you're going to put that elevation of the highest adjacent grade next to the building. And then for G, you're going to enter the height of the floodproofing measures above the lowest adjacent grade. So again, it has instructions in here. And then making sure that it's signed and sealed by an engineer or architect. And also having it signed by a surveyor for elevation information for J. And then K, that you're certifying that the structure based upon development, upon the design specifications, as-built drawings, coincides with American Society of Civil Engineers 24-05, 24-14, and that any alterations also meet those standards. And then it has additional information as far as meeting the 44 CFR 60.3 C3, that the structure as well as the attendant utilities and sanitary facilities is watertight and floodproof. Design elevation indicated above is substantially impermeable to the passage of water, and making sure that all structural components are capable of resisting hydrostatic, hydrodynamic forces, buoyancy, and impact or debris impact forces. So again, all these different things that when someone is submitting this document, it should be part of the application package. And again, this just coincides with FEMA Technical Bulletin 3, that all these different elements have to be addressed, and that when you're doing the certificate, that all these different measures have been designed and certified to withstand a flood event. So again, the signer of Section 3 certifies has been flood proof, designed with accepted standards of practice. And then again, the licensed engineer or architect is going to put their name, license number, so on and so forth. So again, end of the form. So this here, letter M is really important because again, it's talking about compliance and documentation as far as making sure that you have different pieces and parts accompanying the floodproofing certificate, that there's photographs of shields, gates, barriers, that there's written certification that all portions of the structure below the BFE will render it watertight, substantially impermeable to the passage of water. Again, there should be certification with that. There should be documentation, a comprehensive maintenance plan. Again, talking about the exterior envelope of the structure, all penetration to the exterior of the structure, all shields, gates, barriers, or components designed to provide floodproofing protection to the structure, and then making sure that you have the location of all the shields and components and hardware and specialized tools to seal the structure. So there's additional pieces and parts that need to be part of the application package. This just lists some of those. And again, there's additional information for instructions. And then we have Team Jack. So if you guys have questions, we're more than happy to answer questions now in the chat. If you guys have additional questions, or if you have a floodplain management permit or development that's occurring in your community and you have questions, please feel free to reach out. The one thing that I want to say to everybody is that a lot of times people just forward applicants to me for me to do the permitting and everything from beginning to end. We ask that in the future, from now until eternity, that if you guys have a question, that you've got to be part of the permitting process. That if I'm going to talk to the applicant, you're going to be on the call with me. You're going to be in the meeting with us. That we're willing to help you, but we're not going to do everything for you. But we're part of a team, right? Because you're the star of the show, and Julius and I and Cheyenne are going to be your backup singers, but you're the star of the show. You are the point person. Floodplain management is a local responsibility. So we're here to help you, but it also has to be a team exercise to get floodplain management done in your community. So just want to put that out there, that we're willing to help. Please take advantage of the floodplain management permitting playbook that we just come out with. If you guys haven't had the opportunity to read that and look at it, it's a great resource to kind of help you do that over-the-counter consultation to build up your confidence and your comfortability with talking with folks. So Julius, do you have anything you want to add?
No, Amy did a terrific job. I know this was a lot of slides. I mean, dry floodproofing is a dry topic for wet matter, but you did an awesome job. So just kudos to you again, Amy and Cheyenne, for putting the presentation together. I'm just here to support you guys as best as we can. And just reinforcing what Amy said, this NFIP and floodplain management is a team effort. Everyone has to play their role, and we want to support you guys in all facets when it comes to floodplain management. But we want you guys to be with us from the beginning, not at the tail end trying to deal with compliance. If we could address a lot of the issues that I've seen over the past 9 months with a lot of compliance issues, we're trying to nip all that stuff in the beginning before we get to dealing with compliance. So if we could address the root problems of why, hey, the permits are not being issued, or why the dry floodproofing certification is the only thing that was submitted, and they're missing the maintenance plan and the inspections plan, we want to be able to have this conversation in the beginning and say, hey, if you're going to dry floodproof this building, A plus B plus C plus D has to be, all these documents has to be submitted. So before you as local official issue that certificate of occupancy, making sure that you have all the necessary documentation. So going back to that, reviewing it, assessing it, documenting it. So once you complete the right process, then you could say, hey, everything lines up, everything is good, issue that certificate of occupancy. So dry floodproofing tends to get a lot more complex. A lot of times folks do not want to do it because it's very costly, it's very expensive. So most of the time folks either elate to get the structures elevated, but people do dry floodproof it. So if they do dry floodproof it, they have to do it correctly per your community regulations. So, but overall, hopefully you guys enjoyed this session again. As Amy alluded to in the beginning, if you have specific topics you want us to talk about, as we start planning out the schedule for next year, we only got a couple months left in 2022. But as we start going on with 2023, there's a burning topic you want us to talk maybe about another substantial damage presentation or whatever the topic is, definitely reach out to us. We do have office hours on Mondays. We may extend it to more than 3 hours, depending on the more participation, more involvement we get from folks. But we do make ourselves available every Monday for all 402 communities. So don't be a stranger. If you need help, don't wait for things to hit the fan. Reach out to us. We walk you, we work through whatever the problem is. We have dealt with easy stuff. We have dealt with complex stuff that literally has even stumbled Amy and I. So, but we'll work through it together as a team. So. All right, Amy. I don't think we have any do we have any questions, comments in the chat? I kind of try to address some of them as we're going along different links.
Well, with that, hearing no other questions, comments, concerns, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. Thank you, Cheyenne, for all your help with this, Julius as well. And we'll be back next month to talk about engineering analysis and some of the issues that we've had. We do have an opening right now for an engineering position. So if you know an engineer that's competent and really likes NFIP and would like to have a job reviewing engineering analysis for no rise and other stream developments, please forward that announcement that we sent out last week, and hopefully we'll get some good candidates. So with that, I think we'll adjourn today. Hope everybody has a great day and go enjoy the sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius, Amy, and Cheyenne.
Yeah, always welcome. All right, guys. See you guys next month, or see you in office hours.